Hi all, I'm putting my Understanding Hands lecture and demo online here so that we can have you do it from home since we missed the class period that we would have done it last week. So I'm filming this from my hotel room in Chicago still, should be getting back into town tomorrow, and next week should be as usual. But I think I have a plan to make do, and this will help keep us on track. I'm going to switch to my PowerPoint now. Just give me a second to screen share. Hold on. Okay. Okay, so if this goes as planned, I should be able to film this straight. And so you should follow along and do exactly what I do. And just pause this video at any time if you need to kind of catch up to the step that I'm on, all right? But this should work. Things that you need for this process. You need a washable marker. I'll be providing you with those on during Monday's class, so you can do this as homework. I have a whole pack here ready to go. If you are, I buy the most kid-safe washable markers that I can find, but if you have particular sensitivities to dyes or things like this that you're worried about, I might recommend, if you can get a more skin-safe kind of thing to write on yourself, maybe like an eyeliner pencil or even a thin lipstick, that might be an alternative that you know works well with your body. That might be an alternative. We are going to draw all over our own hand with this marker as we go, and the mapping that we do makes drawing hands a whole lot easier. So you are going to want to find a way to do this along with me. All right. The next thing that you need to have for this assignment is one hand to draw with, like your dominant hand, and one hand to draw on. All of us have two hands, so that should be pretty easy. Immediately after you watch this video, you'll want to jump into the drawing hands exercise that goes with it. You'll want to do that while you still have all of the anatomical mapping, which is what we're going to be doing here, still visible on your hands. So for that, you will want your 18 by 24 drawing pad and probably just regular pencils or colored pencils, whatever you prefer. You'll see the examples in the assignment handout. Okay. Usually I have my skeleton as my assistant for this lecture. I borrow one of its arms. Don't have it here. Didn't bring it on this impromptu trip, but fortunately it was just the week after Halloween. So I was able to find a spooky skeleton hand at Michael's craft store. While it's not nearly as movable and dexterous, the proportions are sound. So I'm going to use this in this lecture instead, and anything that I can't make this skeleton hand do, I will show you using my more sophisticated skeletal model when we're in class together next week. All right. So here we go. What this lesson is going to do is it's going to help you learn how to identify and map anatomical bony landmarks that are visible on the skin surface of your hand, directly on your hand, being able to recognize anatomical bony landmarks. These are areas where the bones kind of, project up and are able to be seen on the surface of the hand, make it much easier for you to standardize your hand drawing approach and just make it much easier to really understand what you're looking at when you see and or observe and draw a hand. I also think the best learning tool for figure drawing is just over and over recognizing that like you live in this, when drawing the human body, you're drawing the form that you live on in. You actually know intuitively more about than probably any other thing you'll ever try to draw. You know how it works, how it looks, how it feels. And if you can just kind of connect the dots between how you simplify and draw those forms and that very, very ingrained recognition that you already have as a human for what they are and do, it just makes the whole body drawing process less mystifying, and you just get really good at it really fast. So it's always really fun for me to teach you all how to do this. All right. So let's go ahead, get your marker ready, get your hand to draw with and draw on ready, and here we go. All right, the first thing that's going to be helpful, and these terms will come up kind of as we talk in all sorts of different stages of the body, is knowing kind of anatomical, technical speak for the directions and planes of the hand. And later we'll connect these same kind of language to the rest of the body. All right. So the first plane that we're going to look at is the sagittal plane of the hand, radial aspect. So when you hear sagittal, think side plane, and radial aspect is referring to the radius bone. The radius bone is the bone that sits directly, the forearm bone that sits directly above the thumb. All right, I think you can see so here's the thumb, this is the radius. So when you are looking at the thumb side of your hand, you are looking at the sagittal plane and the radial aspect. All right, next we're going to look at the dorsal aspect. That is what we know as the back of the hand. Think dorsal fin on a dolphin. It sits right on this back. So your back of your hand is called the dorsum or the dorsal aspect. All right. If we turn again and look at the pinky side of our hand, we're looking at the another sagittal plane. Remember, sagittal means side. And the ulnar aspect. The ulna is the bone that sits directly above your pinky and reaches all the way to finish as that big bony projection that we know as the elbow, that jointed elbow. So it's that long forearm bone is called the ulna, and it sits just above your pinky finger. All right, and then the last aspect that we're going to look at is the palmar aspect, and palm of your hand, palmar aspect. Kind of makes sense. All right. So the first things that we are going to map are going to be the position of your wrist bones. For the whole rest of the time we look at this presentation, you want to look down in this lower right hand corner of the slide. There you're going to see the example of exactly the lines that I'm going to have you map and find and draw on your own hand. I'm also going to go ahead and draw them on my hand. I'm going to grab a dark blue marker because I think it's the one that might show best on camera. You can use whatever color you have. We only need one color marker for this. All right. So what I want you to do is go ahead, rest your hand, your non-dominant hand, the one you don't draw with, flat on the table. I'll probably kind of just hold mine up. Looking palm side down, so you're looking at the back of the hand or the dorsum. And now using your dominant hand, I want you to run your finger across your wrist, just like this. And you're going to find two bony projections. One is going to be more prominent. It's probably the really sticky, kind of really sticks out, and it's going to sit above your pinky. All right, and that's going to be, we call that the distant head of the radius. That's a very bottom lump that sit at the very end of the long bone of your forearm. So it goes from elbow down to this lump. And that is really the projection that defines that kind of what we know is the wrist joint, all right? And, you know, for some people, they see it more prominently when the hand is flat. For others, they actually, you know, if you kind of twist your hand a little, you can see it more. But what I want you to do is just feel that lump with your finger. And when you feel like you found it, go ahead and circle it with your marker. All right, so this is going to be that lumpy head of the ulna, what we recognize and probably call our wrist bone, actually, that sits above the pinky, just kind of just next to that side plane. Makes sense? All right, now if you keep running your finger kind of across your hand right at that location, above your thumb, at about the same kind of distance away as the last projection, we are going to find the styloid process, which is also the distant end, think, of the radius. Remember, the radius is the bone that sits above the thumb. I'll show you on my skeleton model, we're looking for this little lump that sits on the very side. This is a kind of a sharper shape. It feels smaller. It's you know, you might see it more or feel it more as kind of like an oval. How can I show this to you? Oval shape as you map it. And it does stick out. It feels, I guess I always think it feels kind of sharp, and it's sitting just above that thumb. I hope you can see what I'm doing here. All right. I think my drawing also shows it pretty well. Once you found the location of those wrist bones, this is where what you're feeling is the point where the ends of the forearm bones, the radius and the ulna, joint with the carpal bones. It's a kind of, I guess we'd say sort of at the top of the hand. They're actually still kind of technically in the wrist. We'll get to that next. So right through the center of that joint, I want you to, of each of those locations, I want you to connect them with a line that looks like that. I might do the rest of this presentation like this. I think it might be easier for you to see what I'm drawing, or maybe I'll stand up and sit down. Sorry, this is a bit impromptu. Like I said, usually I do this in person, but I think we'll make it through. All right. So pause here if you need time to rewind, see what I said, find those locations. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next slide. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to locate and very simply share the kind of end of our, or the space of our carpal bones. So, or massive carpal bones. So the wrist is arguably the most complicated joint in the whole human body. The wrist capacity for nuanced motion is facilitated by an intricate meeting of 8 small, very specific bones that sit kind of just below the forearm bones, but just above the long bones of the hand. So and these are called the carpal bones. There's 8 of them. I have them listed here. All right. We don't need to know them. This is always the rule with artist anatomy. If you can't see them from the outside surface, you don't need to know that much about them. But you do need to know kind of where they start, where that region of them starts and stops. Because for artists, because they have so much complexity and nuance of motion and really do facilitate a lot of that, the really intricate hand movements, if you don't suggest that kind of interesting directions and twists and turns and shapes that it can occur in the wrist, the way you draw the connection between the hand gets oversimplified and it looks kind of cartoony. It looks kind of stiff, and it doesn't really feel like it naturally is reflecting what you see and what the wrist and hand can actually do. So here's my suggestion. You have to kind of learn to look for it like the shape where all of that action happens and start noticing kind of how it changes. And so I think kind of creating some bracing lines kind of between where that carpal mass starts and where it finishes really helps you tune you in your observation to what you see in those areas. So let me show you how we're going to find that. What I want you to do is I want you to take your fingers, and people have different kind of relationships. Not everyone can necessarily reach their fingers all the way around their wrist, but just kind of reach your fingers around like a bracelet. If you can touch, great. If not, that's fine. But make sure that that it's kind of a tight relationship. And then what I want you to do is I want you to slide your fingers without letting them loosen as far as you can up your wrist. And what I think you'll probably run into as you do that, so we start here, come up, is you're going to feel the hand start widening at the metacarpals. It usually is about 1.5 inches up. For me, I feel that widening right here. And I can feel it kind of widen as I move towards that thumb. So here I am down in the wrist. You can see I kind of hit a hard stop as I reach around. All right, and so at that point, where I feel my hand kind of widen to move into that thumb, and same token, feel like it gets a little bit wider. You can feel this sort of transitional change of direction about 1.5 inches up. I'm going to make 2 dash marks and create a connected line, just like that. The space between the wrist that we created on the last slide and that line that we felt where the thumb and that pinky kind of starts to widen is going to show that full kind of distance of the 8 carpal bones. And so now that I have these 2 lines drawn, you can more easily see what I'm saying. If I pull let's look at kind of directions and movements of the wrist. There's extension of the wrist, that is the flexing backwards towards the dorsal plane, kind of bending back towards the back of that forearm. And you can see how those 2 lines get to kind of compress as I extend that wrist. And then there's flexion of the wrist. That wrist kind of pulls back towards the inside of the forearm, just like that. And you can see those 2 lines kind of stretch apart in that. And then there's ulnar deviation. That's where the hand can tilt back, kind of as if you're pulling the pinky back down towards the forearm. And so now you can see we have widening kind of through that carpal region, and then kind of more compression on that pinky or ulnar side. And then there's radial deviation, which is very hard for me to do from that point of view, but that is when we have the hand flex. Let me see if I can show you better this way, towards the thumb. There it is. So ulnar deviation, radial deviation, ulnar deviation, radial deviation. We would be doing that a lot if we were waving our hand. Make sense? All right. There's also rotation of the hand that is called pronation. I'm going to demonstrate this more formally again when I have my better skeletal model. But the head of the radius is actually able to joint like an opening and closing door, but it's also this kind of round shape, so it can rotate in its socket. And so it's able to rotate and actually cross over the ulna, which can allow us to take our hand from that open palm forward position to that's called a supine pose, to a pronated pose, which the radius, which sits above the thumb, rotates in its socket and allows us to bring our thumb in towards our body so that we, when looking, we kind of view the back or the dorsum of the hand rather than the palm. Really important motion. I absolutely will be probably talking about this, demonstrating this a lot through the figure unit, but one of the kind of most graceful things of the human body, and something really important for drawers to notice, is how the shape of the forearm actually kind of changes depending on whether the arm's in a supine position. If it's in the supine position, this is really the only position my cheap, spooky skeleton arm can do. The two forearm bones, the ulna and the radius, they sit side by side. But if they're pronated, radius rotates, is able to cross over the ulna. And when it crosses over, the forearm actually starts kind of looking to be a bit of a different shape. So it looks wider from top to bottom when the forearm is supined and the two bones are sitting together, kind of like a number 11. When they cross and make more of an X shape above the wrist, you can see that the forearm gets much narrower, and then it more strongly and obviously widens up towards the elbow. So see how that wrist looks more narrow in the pronated position when the thumb is in towards the body. When I pull back to supine, that forearm looks a little bit wider for all the way from wrist up to elbow. See how this area looks a bit narrower because the bones are crossed and pronated. Pull back to supine position, it looks slightly wider. You will definitely be able to see this more in person. I'll point it out a lot during our further study. All right. So the next thing that we're going to draw is we are going to draw the metacarpal bones. Things get a little bit simpler once you get past those carpal bones. So I think I'll move a little bit faster now. Metacarpal bones sit in the metacarpal, the region of the hand called the metacarpus. All right, that lies between carpal bones of the wrist, and then there are these long bones that reach out to our first knuckles that we see very strongly. Their distal ends, bottom ends project very clearly. The way, in anatomical terms, these bones are identified as, actually they're numbered. So the first metacarpal bone, all right, go ahead and make a fist and feel your way through this as I show you. The first metacarpal bone sits right before we transition into what we know as our thumb. So it's this lumpy projection. Second sits above our pointer finger. Third, middle finger. Fourth, ring finger. That's the distal end of the fourth metacarpal. Fifth metacarpal is the pinky finger. The end of these metacarpal bones and the joint where they connect to our finger bones or our first phalange bones, when you're making a fist, are very, very prominent, obvious. Like when you see them, like if you squeeze hard, you can pop out. We call that white knuckling. So that's what I'm gonna do, squeeze hard. And I actually kind of like to start with the second metacarpal, the one that's right over the pointer finger. I think it's really easy to see. So what I want you to do is just circle each knuckle. You end up looking like you have those cartoon tough guy knuckle gloves on, which I think looks kind of cool. Or like you're gonna punch someone. After you've found all of those projections, I think it's easier to find the thumb one. We're just looking for those joints. All right, and so now you have kind of tough guy glove. You've connected all, or you've identified and mapped the location of the joints or distal ends of the metacarpal bones. And what we're going to do next is we're going to connect the joint where the metacarpal bones meet the finger bones, which are called the phalanges, is exactly in the center of each circle. You can't really ever see that joint like super clearly because there is a tendon that runs right over that joint and kind of disguises it. But what I want you to do is I want you to connect all those joints, even the thumb, with a line that goes from center of the first to center of the second to center of the third to center of the fourth to center of the fifth. See that? All right, and that's what you're going to map on this slide. The next thing that we're going to map is there are two planes in the metacarpus region. This is something a lot of people don't really notice until it's time to kind of start learning to draw hands. But the thumb actually sits on a different plane than the rest of the carpal bones. The thumb and its metacarpal region that relates to it sits 90 degrees to the rest of the hand. So like unless you have your hand pushed flat on a table, like you're ready to draw like trace it and then make it into a Thanksgiving turkey, usually you don't see, for most view of the body, you aren't going to see the thumb at the same time that you see the rest, the back of the hand or the dorsal region. So the radial sagittal plane, the side plane that the thumb lives on, might be visible, and you'll kind of only see that first pointer finger, or you can see the second, third, fourth, fifth metacarpal bones. You'll see that entire dorsal plane, the entire back of the hand. You'll see all the way up to the wrist, but you can see my thumb really from that view kind of disappears. And so when you are observing a hand in a pose and drawing it, that's something you want to identify early on and define. Like, so, okay, I'm really looking at that sagittal or side plane, and I'm only seeing the thumb and that first or second kind of pointer finger mostly. And then the rest of the planes of the hands are kind of disappearing, kind of turned away from me. Or I'm really only seeing the dorsium and I can't see in this pose the thumb at all. So don't worry about drawing something you can't see. All right, if we make our hand into a fist again, it makes it much easier to kind of define the limits of these planes. What I want you to do we'll claim the dorsal region first. What I want you to do is I want you to go to the outside edge of that second metacarpal, that pointer finger metacarpal, and I want you to stretch a line that goes all the way back. This would be kind of, I guess what we'd say, sort of outside edge of that first knuckle circle to the inside edge of the radial wrist bone. See how I connected those? And then what I want you to do is I want you to go from the outside edge of the fifth metacarpal, that's your pinky one, to the outside edge of the ulnar wrist bone. Okay, and you can see that the shape that we get that sort of connects from the line, that carpal line, down to the metacarpal line, claims that dorsum is kind of a rectangle, kind of, I guess probably better say it's like a trapezoid shape. Okay, then what we're going to do is with one more line to draw, we're going to go from the outside edge of that first thumb metacarpal back to the outside edge of the radial wrist metacarpal, and we end up with a triangle shape that claims the plane that leads us to the thumb. Just like that. Okay, get your hand to look like my example or look like what you see. So this is our thumb plane, this is our dorsal plane, and those would be very simple shapes that you'll get to draw that'll make it, when you start being able to see the landmarks that link to them, you'll be able to construct that upper hand shape with either a connected trapezoid that reaches from wrist to knuckle, and a triangle that leads us from wrist to thumb. Okay. All right. Sorry, my phone's making noise. Next slide. Movements of the thumb. And this is always fun to look at and do kind of as you have your hand mat. So there are, there's adduction of the thumb. Our thumb's really one of the things that makes us so special, able to use tools. Its length and its dexterity. So abduction of the thumb is the pulling away from the rest of the fingers forward. Like that. All right. So abduction, think child's being abducted, stolen away, removed from the rest of the finger family. Adduction, think addition, it's added back in. All right. Then there's extension. Extension of the thumb is actually lateral or kind of side to side. So extension of the thumb is the moving out away, kind of to make that L for Louisville shape. And flexion moves back towards the palm to make, let's think about like I'm 4 years old. All right, so flexion in, 4 years old, extension out, Louisville, go Cards, I guess, even though we go to IU. I shouldn't say that. Anyway, the next thing that we, and this is the move that actually makes humans so special, is the fact that we can, it's called opposition of the thumb and 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd finger. We're the only species that can actually connect their thumb to their pinky finger, which really gives us a lot more dexterity and ability to grasp, hold in complex forms and use and create kind of tools the way we are. It's this move that's so important to what humans are able to do with their hands. So there's opposition and then reposition, this sort of baseline hand position or position for the thumb is just like that. Like, hi. All right, the next thing that we are going to look at is we're going to look at the phalange bones. You've probably heard of those fingers being called phalanges before. So for the 4 fingers of the dorsum, which again come off of metacarpal 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 3 phalange bones. There's the proximal that comes just off of those knuckles, the intermediate phalanges, just beyond them, and then there's the distal phalanges, which are the smallest bones that are furthest away, our fingernails sit on top of those, above, at the skin level of our distal phalange bones. The thumb is missing the intermediate, that second joint. So it only has a proximal phalange and a distal phalange, it disjointed at one point instead of the two that the other fingers are. All right, guess we just didn't need that one. In terms of locating the exact position and joint of our phalange bones, knuckles give it away really easily. So in terms of drawing those positions, what I'm going to have you do and walk you through is mapping based on what you see of your knuckle. All right. These knuckle joints probably get more and more obvious the older you are, but kind of even you can find them on even little tiny baby fingers. The easiest joint to probably identify is the connection between proximal phalanges, that first joint of the fingers, and the intermediate phalanges, first joint of those fingers. I always think they look kind of like elephant knees. In my little diagram in the lower right, I just recommended that you kind of look at those joints and draw a line that goes from the edge of that kind of wrinkly circle that you see on the joint to the other end. I've kind of amended that. I think people have an easier time since we've done so much circling that first joint. So either with your hand clasped like this, so those knuckles really stick out, or with your fingers extended so you really see that kind of round, wrinkly shape. What I want you to do is just go through, and from edge of wrinkle, edge of bone, to edge of bone, I want you to circle that knuckle. And these joints really do reach pretty much, if you're looking straight down at the top of your hand, they really do reach kind of exactly across the entire kind of width of that finger as you look at the top. So if I just hold my hand flat, you can see those circles. What I'm saying is those circles really reach from edge to edge. I'll explain why that's cool and important, either on the next slide or the one after that, I don't remember. But that's a really useful thing. I'll tell you one in there. So first circle. All right. And then what you are going to do, so I'm going to figure out why hold on, getting a low battery signal. I may have fixed it, sorry. Then what I want you to do is, after you make the circle, I want you to draw a line clear through the center of it. Just like this. Ultimately, and I'll talk about this later, when we draw, we kind of look at as if there's an implied line, and we kind of draw an implied line that connects all of these knuckles across, rather than just kind of looking at the length up. It makes this kind of arc. And so probably you might have seen, if you've ever seen kind of instructions for drawing hands, people kind of creating this sort of gestural arc that indicates this connecting line that across all the knuckles. And what the implied line that they're connecting is, they're kind of imagining this sort of line or thread that connects center of knuckle to center of knuckle all the way across. And that puts like a landmark on the page that kind of shows you how far to reach to kind of start creating each of those fingers. Okay. All right. And then the next thing that we're going to do is so that claims the distance between the proximal first phalange. So after you've drawn that first circle joint, go ahead back to the metacarpal bone below it and connect the edges with the line. This claims the top plane. Of each finger. So I'm not connecting through the center. You can see I'm going edge of circle to edge of circle, just like that. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. Next joint I think is slightly harder to see. Usually I think in most hands they aren't kind of, this joint isn't encircled like that first phalange joint is. You'll see it more as a line that cuts kind of across the knuckle. Again, it looks like just kind of one of those creases in the hand. You can draw across at each joint. So this defines the distal or distant edge of the intermediate joint of our four fingers of the dorsum. Okay. And then what we're going to do is to get these planes to connect all the way to the edge. So kind of claiming the limits of the top planes of our fingers here by moving from joint to joint, and also defining the distance between proximal phalanges and then the span of the intermediate phalange bone. And then to define and kind of connect the shapes to the distal point, claiming the top plane of finger, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and draw lines that connect to either side of each related fingernail. And so we're going to define the full distance or length of the distal phalanges as the distance from the distal or distant end of the intermediate phalange bones to the bottom of the fingernails, something like that. And once you have all of those lines drawn, you can, you can start noticing the change in scale between each of those joints. And I think this is really cool because our fingers can pretty reliably follow the rule that happens kind of throughout our body. Our body is designed to be able to curl in on itself. So as we move up the body, every part of us is just scaled exactly a little bit larger so that we can kind of curl back up on ourselves and kind of become sort of protected and self-contained. So what I mean is, if we look at like the length of these phalange bones, if I take the distal phalange region, that scale, and I pull it down once, what I will see is the scale of the distal phalanges is about 3/4 the scale of the intermediate phalange bone. The scale of the intermediate phalange bone is about 3/4 the scale of the proximal phalange bone. The proximal phalange bone is actually about 3/4. Oops, I gotta scale that up. So I'm reaching from center line to center line to get these measurements. The proximal phalange bone is about 3/4 the scale of the carpal bone. And then we can actually even move all of this, the scale of the hand from our longest, that's our middle finger, back to that proximal edge of the wrist, which is going to be where the radius and ulna meet the carpal bones. So all the way down to the center of that circle, kind of hard to reach. But that scale is actually 3/4 the length of the forearm. The bones of the forearm, the radius and the ulna, if we got those scaled, which I can't actually, my fingers, we just talked about that. They're only 3/4 the length of the previous, but that distance from of the radius and ulna is 3/4 the length of the humerus, that arm bone. It's cool. The humerus is actually 3/4 the length of the femur, kind of usually. Now, of course, everybody varies a little bit. Those proportions, we're dealing with adults, not kids, or kids are scaled very proportionally different as they're growing. But anyway, we end up kind of having these somewhat standardized rules, which are really helpful to use. All right. But so far we have, and I think that my little model down here will make it even easier if you are confused. But make sure that you have kind of strapped and connected each of those joints. Let me turn before I get too far. And I'm going to claim the joint that occurs between the proximal and distal phalanges of the thumb. Make a line straight through it. And then on either side of that knuckle circle, I'm going to claim the top plane by connecting it back to that first carpal bone, just like this. And just like I did with the fingers, even though we don't have an intermediate phalange, I'm going to connect lines that reach down to either side of the fingernail to complete the top plane and suggest the span of the distal bone. That distal bone is usually 3/4 the length of the proximal phalange, although I will say humans' thumbs, that proportion deviates crazy amounts from people to people. Some people have much shorter distal regions and their thumbs work just fine. Some have longer where they're more like comparably scaled. Also, those thumbs work great. Don't know why there's more variation in the thumb than the rest of the hand, just something you look for from person to person. And if yours is very different in scale, doesn't make you weird. I mean, pretty much everybody's is very different. Looking at the movement of the fingers, we have flexion, extension. So flexion, balling up your fist, pulling it in, extension, long, straight, pulled back fingers kind of from center. Hyperextension is even further. We have abduction, that's the pulling away from one finger from the rest of the group, and adduction, adding them back together, joining them back to that kind of initial neutral position. The cool thing about, another cool thing about movements of the fingers is actually none of the muscles that occur, like control movements of the fingers, actually occur in, the muscles aren't located in the fingers themselves. You have the tendons that connected to the muscles that are responsible. But for flexion and extension, the muscles that you will feel are actually up in the forearm. So what I want you to do is grab your forearm just like this. And then the muscles that control flexion are going to be on this underside of your arm. So hold on that underside and flex your hand, and you will feel, you can flex one finger at a time, and you will feel those muscles individually kind of dance, or you can pull them all together and you will feel them harden as they flex. They move down into little ropey tendons. They then connect into kind of a tendinous sheet in the palm. But where you feel that movement and action is actually in the upper forearm. And so the upper forearm kind of changes shape also, you'll notice, depending on whether the hand is flexed. See that? I think you can see that one better than feel. The ones you can see more actually relate to extension of the hand. The extension of the hand is actually controlled by muscles that live up in that back of that forearm, just above the elbow. So if you can grab right there. And then if you just move your finger slowly from a flex to an extended position. Make your fingers kind of hyperextend and dance that way. You will see and feel those little, those muscles flex and their tendons kind of dance across your hand. So if you wiggle your fingers and look at the back of the hand, you'll see what maybe you knew they were tendons, maybe you kind of assumed they were bones, but they're the tendons that connect to the muscles way up here that control that hand movement and that you can see as you move the hand. So the thing that makes hands particularly, finger joints are pretty simple joints, actually. They they only open and shut, like opening and closing a door, like your knee, like your elbow. Not that complicated. But the reason hands get so complex to draw is we can do that flexing extension motion at the same time as we can do the abduction adduction motion, and we can do those in every kind, every finger can decide to be in a different position. Well, we decide that we want them to be in a different position. So if the hand only could do this, it would be very easy to kind of draw those shapes and be more like sort of an animal paw in terms of its motion. Well, scratch that, animals can do this too, but anyway, kind of a simpler kind of like, think like Hello Kitty kind of paw motion. But the fact that we can do this and splay our fingers or pull it in at the same time is what makes understanding and recognizing the shapes of your hand really complicated. And a lot of times what people, when they're drawing hands, get really frustrated is when we just look at like the edge of the finger forms and we draw them in positions where they're both flexing or extending and abducting. When we draw just kind of a contour line of those finger shapes, the fingers can, it flattens the form in a way that makes the fingers look really broken. You can have drawn exactly the right perimeter shape and you end up with fingers that look really kind of witchy and impossible, and it's hard to convince your brain that you've done it right. And so artists have a special step that a lot of, we probably don't teach you early enough, but what really experts in figure drawing know to do is something that we call squaring up. And that's actually what a lot of this mapping process is setting out to show you. Squaring up involves really, in a strong way, identifying both the joints, which we've really been talking about, discussing, finding with our mapping, but also defining the planes of the hands as value transitions, or showing the different planes of the hands as defined by how light finds them or doesn't find them, light and shadow. So here is the hand where we've just drawn the contour edges of the form. Here, same three hands. These look, they are accurate, but they look a little unstructured, a little broken. But if I add planes that help show the transition from the top plane of the hand, where we see the top of the knuckles, and the side plane and how light finds it differently, all of a sudden, we can recognize, oh, okay, that looked weird because I was seeing simultaneously on this finger, the top plane where the knuckles live and the side plane as a transition. And then the next one, I see mostly the top plane and very little of the side plane. And then the next one, I see kind of that inside side plane and all of the top plane. Does that make sense? And so by defining and really showing those planes, we can make the hands make a heck of a lot more sense. So that's kind of the next stage. What we've done with our mapping so far is we have defined all of the top planes of our hands, all the hands living, all the planes living on the dorsal side and the radial sagittal side of the thumb. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pull the mapping over from the back to the palmar side of the hand, so that we can finish those shapes and really use them to show how we square up those hand forms. So here we go. And the next thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and start with the fingers. But from each of those lines that we see defining a joint, what I want you to do is I want you to pull it around and connect that back joint, dorsum joint, to where the fold in the skin that defines the joint on the palmar aspect of the hand. So again, from the center line, now I'm doing intermediate phalange joint for the second finger, coming around to the other side. See what I'm doing? This one kind of blows people's mind. If I take this first joint of the hand here, this carpal, metacarpal bone, I'm going to take that joint, I'm going to pull it around, and it's actually going to get to this first, I don't think it's what people call your lifeline, but this first fold of the palm that comes right through the center. When you see this fold, this is the one that kind of lets people really know that the edges of the ends of the fingers and that carpal joint actually don't fall in the same place. We have the secondary line that actually doesn't actually relate to any bony joint. It's just this kind of soft, we have more kind of soft tissue and muscle mass that sits in the palm. And so it's that transition between tissue that sits on the palmar side of the proximal phalange bone and this kind of a mass of palmar tissue. But the joint actually sits down in the second line. Does that make sense? I think you'll be able to see it better on your hand. So I'm going to, up to that line, I'm going to keep doing this, where I take those center lines and I pull them around each finger. These are my proximal joints. Connection between intermediate and distal. So I've pulled those all around. And now, if you look at, and I'll do it on the thumb as well. Now, if you just look at your hand, you can probably already start seeing how it would be easier to see and recognize. You can see where you've put those lines are pretty close to where light and shadow transitions tend to be too. And you should start to be able to see like, oh, if I was drawing those shapes, they end up being much simpler shapes to see, much simpler shapes to draw. They really help show limits between those planar shifts once you have them drawn, just like this. Okay. All right, and then just two more shapes that we'll want to draw. We can claim our the transition at proximal or top edge of the carpal region or metacarpal region where it meets our carpal bones. Transition kind of from hand shapes to wrist shapes. Taking this line and pulling it through those lower palmar shapes, this kind of bottom edge of the palm, just like that. And then you can go ahead and extend that carpal region. I think I drew it as if it comes a little bit higher. This time I did a little bit more straight, but you really are just taking a line and kind of making that into sort of a bracelet shape. There's actually a tendinous band that wraps around your entire wrist that kind of sits in exactly this region too. It's why the skin gets so kind of tight through those wrist shapes. So these two lines kind of define that shape as well, that tendon shape. Okay. And then we have two kind of important muscle shapes that really help inform those movements of opposition and reposition of the hand. Sorry, I keep moving out of sight. That's the thenar eminence. It's a big kind of muscle shape that you see here. And then you have the hyperthenar eminence. It sits below the pinky. All right, just like that. All right, and so now I'm going to switch to a slightly, so that's all of the mapping that we want on the hand. And what I want you to do now is you're going to start a drawing process where you are going to draw your hand, but instead of trying to draw the complex, organic, very handy-like shapes first, what I want you to do is you're going to build your hand by just drawing every line that you have drawn and mapped on your hand. So you're going to draw the two circles of the wrist exactly in the position you see them as you observe your hand. You're going to draw the lines that move through the centers of those joints and connect in the top plane. You're going to draw the metacarpal space by defining the position of each of those metacarpal knuckles and connecting them by a line that moves right through that shape. If you can't see any of those shapes, you don't have to draw them, but you just draw the shapes that you see. You'll draw that triangular thenar shape if that's what you see. And then you'll go through and you'll draw these rectangular shapes that reach up to the next joint of the top plane. If you see the side plane kind of come down from those shapes after, those will be this second thing you draw. Let me switch to show you some student examples. Sorry, I don't quite have them in this PowerPoint, but I do have them on Canvas. Hopefully this doesn't crash. There we go. Come on, open up. Yeah, perfect. It's coming, I promise, I hope. Here it comes. And then you'll draw your hand in 10 different poses using those shapes. So Emily does a really good job. You can see she drew all of the shapes that she drew on her hand first. And then as a second stage, she starts going through and drawing the more organic, kind of rounded, subtle shapes that are not defined by the things we map, but they kind of are flanked by the things that are mapped. Makes the hands look more hand-like after we've used our mapping to define the positions. And you're going to end up, if you follow these tricks, you're going to end up being able, observing that your hand in these different positions, drawing every line that you've seen drawn on there, and then drawing the edges that relate to the mapping after. Those are the more organic shapes. The last thing you'll do, and these instructions are very clearly written out in this handout too, is you will then make the hands look even more realistic by adding light and value planes. If you can do this kind of like I am under a desk lamp, so you have a very strong kind of a source of illumination from above, it makes it really easy to see the planes, see the shadows, and draw them. All right, so many different positions. Let it show the structure. It'll work really well. All right, after you've used so this is as finished as you need to get with this, showing me the structure, giving me proportional hands, giving me some shadow. But if you want to, you can decide to start even kind of erasing some of the structural lines as a second step. So the student did some where she was really defining that structure, but then she later, and that's how she started these hands, but then as a second step, she started erasing them just because she wanted to get the chance to make the hands look realistic, like they have volume, without that interruption of those guidelines. And that's fine by me, as long as the hands have good logic and are kind of sourced in the process. So you can see some of them, she shows that she was paying attention to those proportions, and some of them she ultimately erased some of that mapping, but just used more gentle kind of value shifts to show that she understands how to position the shapes, recognize the shifting planes, create volume in the hands. So up to you. All right. You actually have quite a while to complete this. We can talk about it in person. We can look at them together. We can also practice this looking at the model in these next couple class periods that we have the model too. So I think it's going to work okay to do this remotely. But if you have more questions, just let me know. All right. Thanks everyone for your patience with me. And I hopefully the rest of the class will go as a little bit more as normal. All right. Thanks all. See you soon. Bye.